And yeah, so Carlos Cisco asks this question. This is what I mean about Crack the Sun and why it's like now it's a whole bunch of us are working on it, right? Because Carlos says, I wonder if since Rodar von Glauer, you know, our version of Strahd, since Rodar von Glauer is dead, right? I mean, he's a vampire. He's the king of the vampires. Does being an acolyte of Count Rodar von Glauer, and the context here is that the acolyte class is all about dedicating yourself to some greater power, not a god, like a godlike entity, like Cthulhu, Godzilla, stuff like that. Not always dark, some, you know, archfey and stuff like that. And that in the process, you surrender your own ancestral identity, right? So all the abilities you get for being a dwarf, for being a human or whatever, you're giving those up and they're being replaced with new physical properties from your patron. And that's called becoming. And it is, if you're detecting a kind of sinister bent to it, yeah, there are acolytes of the unicorn, acolyte of Balisantarax, a good elder dragon. You can mean, there's no moral implication behind being an acolyte, except that, like, not in principle, but in practice, yeah, a lot of acolytes have this dark cast to them. They're villainous heroes, often, not exclusively. Like Leech is a good example if you watch The Change of Acheron. Didn't know that his patron, didn't know who his patron was. He was chosen, right? And when he found out, it's like, all right, well, I guess I work for the good guys. And so Carlos was like, so is being an acolyte of Count Rodar von Glauer, does that mean that becoming, for that acolyte, because there's the lore is there's only one acolyte of a patron at a time, that acolyte is becoming von Glauer and assuming his identity and persona and becoming him? And that's when someone stakes von Glauer, he doesn't die. He just becomes this disembodied, kind of like Sauron, this disembodied force waiting for an acolyte to pour his soul into, right? And maybe some acolytes historically of von Glauer, they didn't know that was the deal and they fought against it, but von Glauer was, his mind is too powerful. And I responded to that and I was like, so there might be some kind of like feels bad moment in there that I can't detect yet. So I'm open to that possibility. But that sounds to me exactly like what Draw Steel is about. No half measures, right? We do it for real. And that's one of the reasons we like doing lots of ancestries and lots of classes, because people will come to a class and they'll discover how specific it is. They won't notice how in that specificity, we create lots of flavor and options. Right. So I was listening to a review the other day and they said, I literally had not only 2 shadows in my party, they were 2 black ash shadows in the party. And so they're same class and same subclass, but just the fact that they had different kits made them play completely differently. And they were never in the same place doing the same thing on the battlefield. One was a ranged character, one was a melee character, like the Arcane Archer versus the Mountain. Wow, those were 2 really different characters. Yeah, so you look at the class and you think, my God, this is so specific. But then you keep looking, you go, oh, wow, and then it opens up into all of this variety. Yes. But that initial specificity allows us to do stuff like say, yeah, if you're an acolyte of von Glauer, that means you become von Glauer. And if people are like, wait, I want to be an acolyte. And I don't, well, there's lots of flavors of acolyte. That's just one. If you don't want to become von Glauer, don't become an acolyte of that guy, right? And other games, especially the more commercial games, I think this is one of the interesting places that Draw Steel lives. To me, it is a deliberately commercial product. Of course, everything we do is, you want an idiosyncratic work of art? Well, those are my novels, right? But the Draw Steel it represents everything I think, not only about RPGs, but about, you know, them as a product. And that commercial bent sits right next to this really idiosyncratic and specific implementation. And so you get this interesting, I think, in my opinion, you get the best of both worlds. I guarantee you there are other people that feel the opposite, right? But yeah, it has this almost like, I feel like, this is very personal, and I might not think this an hour from now. It has a kind of indie vibe in the sense of like, my God, this stuff is so specific and idiosyncratic. But it also, I feel like, has this real commercial appeal where it's like, yeah, but there's a lot of options. If you feel like that is too specific, well, that's fine. There's like, we just keep making new classes and new ancestries because sooner or later we're going to hook you, and you're going to be like, yeah, that's anyway. So now that's an example that what Carlos was saying. And I was like, yeah, that's the Draw Steel version of the Vampire Lord as a patron. Now we are like Paul and I and Willie and Jordy and Teos. We're going through the Crack the Sun drafts and we're saying, okay, all right, like how do we take this, which is this does what it needs to do. This is an adventure. Ooh, and now where do we find the places to step on the gas and go, hang on a minute. Did we just do it? Or did we plus it? Did we raise the bar? Now I'm really behind on chat. I'm 13 minutes behind on chat. I did get a guitar, and I took my first like 7 lessons last night from Michael Palmisano on GuitarGate, and the first 6 lessons were, all right, let me show you how to tune your guitar. And he said something I was detecting it, but then I was done, and so then I got to that point in the lesson, and he was like, oh, tune up. He goes, it doesn't matter if you're sharp or flat, go below the note and then work up, because that means the string is in tension when it gets to the right note. And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, yeah, that's what I should have done. That's why I kept being like, why does it keep going out of tune? Why does string 6 out of tune by the time I'm done tuning string 1? Well, because I was tuning it down instead of up, so it wasn't in tension. I was like, got it. And then he got to the lesson that is the first real lesson. Oh, and also, I feel like I had a little bit of a breakthrough. Those of you who don't know about my guitar journey, me and a bunch of other guys at the video game company I was at got super, super into Guitar Hero when it came out, right? Little plastic guitars. And my friend Jeff Vaughn, bought a fucking blues guitar and started teaching himself actual guitar. And I was like, holy shit. And over the course of just like a couple of weeks, because this is classic, like it was the early 2000s, but very much still that 1990s era of game development where it's almost all guys. That's changed a lot, although it's got a long way to go. It was almost all guys, almost all young, straight white dudes in their 20s in essentially a very, very low rent frat house. Right? Where you were just expected to be there 16 hours a day. And it's kind of hard to explain why that was expected. And when this expectation did not come from management or ownership, it came from the devs. This was self-imposed. And part of it was, what else are you going to do? Go home to your empty apartment and your cat and just sit there and wait? So stay here where everybody else is, right? It's a whole team full of misanthropes, basically. And it was only like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 weeks. And Jeff is playing stuff I can recognize. I'm like, fuck off. So I went, all right, I want to get a guitar. And my friend Pete, who I loved Pete. Pete was awesome. It probably still is awesome. He was like, you impressed me as a Steinberger man. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, you would recognize a Steinberger. It's a headless guitar. It's the guitar all the prog bands were playing in the 80s. And I was like, oh, I think I know what you mean. Like, it's just like a stick. He's like, yeah, a lot of them didn't even have a body, right? And so I went and I looked and I got a Steinberger Spirit. And it's a really cool looking, the headless guitar thing is a really cool technology. And in theory, they never go out of tune. In fact, somebody said you could literally drive a car over one of these and it will stay in tune. I'm like, why would you drive a car over it? Anyway, but I could never make it work. I could never make the Spirit work. And so 20 years goes by, you know, and every once in a while I would pick it up and try to fuck with it and try to get more committed. And I would learn some chords and stuff. And it was just there would always come a point very early on where I'm like, well, I can't make my fingers do that. There's not enough room on the fucking fretboard for me to fit my fingers in there. And so I would just give up because I didn't have a teacher. I was trying to do it on my own. And then it was, I think it was David Park Guitar in these chats who was like, oh, that's not a full-size guitar. And I went, what? He goes, yeah, that's like the Steinberger Spirits, they're a budget guitar. That's a three-quarter size guitar. And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? And I never knew that. And Pete never told me that. So that's when I started to kind of refresh, like, all right. And he was the one that said, check out a PRS, which is ultimately, I picked up a lot of guitars. I picked up a Fender, and it was the PRS. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And it's a huge difference, man. And I put the two guitars next to each other, and like my guitar's fretboard ends like 3 frets below the top. That's how different it is. And also, one of the lessons, he was showing you how to hold your guitar. And I had basically been holding my guitar wrong the entire time. I was holding, it's kind of hard to see I was holding the guitar as though the point of focus is the picking hand. So basically, if this is the guitar, if this is the guitar, I was holding the guitar like this, right? And I was always having problems fretting, and I was having problems with the ergonomics. And as I was watching him, and I was like, oh, okay. And I've lost a giant rabbit's worth of weight. I'm like, oh, okay. And I went, zink. I went, here we go. Right now, and all of a sudden, everything I went click. And so that was a really positive moment. And then I got to the first lesson, the first real lesson, which is not about tuning or how to hold the pick or anything like that. It was like, all right, here's your first finger exercise. You're going to go up and down the fretboard. And I was like, all right, it's 11:30. I'm not going to do that. And he, by the way, this is one of the reasons I love Michael Palmisano as a teacher. Like the first lesson, it's all about setting expectations. I realize there's 90% of my audience doesn't care about this, but I got to finish the story. And he says, so here's how it works. You're telling yourself right now, you're so dedicated, you're so passionate, you're going to practice 3 hours a day. I'm here to tell you, no, you're not. No, you're not. It's about building good habits. And it's like popcorn. He doesn't say this is me interpreting it. It's going to go like plink, 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 plink. And then eventually it's going to go plink, and you're just going to be playing all the time and practicing all the time. But you're building to that. You're building good habits. So don't beat yourself up over the fact that you didn't practice today or you didn't practice for a week. You'll just allow yourself, forgive yourself. Otherwise, you'll beat yourself up and you'll feel like I didn't practice today or whatever. And then you feel shame. And then I'm like, yeah, 100%. So what I want to do though is I don't just want to learn how to play the guitar. I want to learn music. So I'm like, okay, these are the frets, or this is E. The open string is E. So I should be able, and I'm probably going to do this. I'm going to get a piece of paper and a pencil. I'm like, all right, I know the scales, right? In theory, I know them, right? So E, so a guitar is every fret is a half step. There's 12 tones, which is 8 whole tones and 4 semitones. And I don't remember where the semitones are. Not every note has a sharp and a flat, because look at the keyboard, there's not a black key between every 2 white keys. So that's the part I don't remember. I used to know this, but I don't remember. But I should be able to sit there and go, okay, if this is E, then the first fret should be 1 half step up from that, which is an A? Wait, no, it goes down to G, right? Doesn't it? Yeah. So E, is there an E? It's either an E sharp or an F, and I don't remember it. So I want to make a map, and I want to go, okay, because I want to be training my ear as I go. I want to know which note is which. I don't want to just practice the fingering. I want to also be trying to, because one of the things I know is that if I go too far down one road, I won't be able to go back and pick up the other thing I want to learn, right? If I wait until this is all second nature to try to learn which note is which, I'll never get there. It'll always be easier for me to just be whatever. I'm just going to use guitar tabs or whatever. So I've sort of got to have the discipline to bake everything I'm trying to learn in as I go, which is going to make it really slow going. But yeah, it takes a long time to learn things. Anyway, blah, blah. Anyway, hey everybody, how you folks doing? Oh, look, Mirai the Sorcerer we were talking about this yesterday. That when people talk about the Jeremy Brett version of Sherlock Holmes as being the kind of the as good as it gets, right? Which I completely agree with. I know people love Razzle Bathbone, but I feel like I'm watching an actor play Sherlock Holmes. When I watch Jeremy Brett, I'm like, that's him. Though. That's Sherlock Holmes. There he is. I'm pretty sure Arthur Conan Doyle knew Jeremy Brett and was like, well, I guess I got to invent this character so that you could play him. People say, yeah, but there's one other series that is as good, if not, for some people think better, and that's the Soviet version. And my understanding is that you can go to the Sherlock Holmes Museum. I think it's like run by the estate in England, and one of the big things they show off, they have like a whole display all about the Russian version of Sherlock Holmes, which I think is amazing. So welcome to the show, everybody. This is one of my new favorite podcasts, which is hosted by thank you, Maldubius, noted historian, writer, columnist, and podcaster Dominic Sandbrook, who's sort of notorious in the UK and largely unknown here. Dominic Sandbrook and one of the producers, Tabby, from The Rest is History, have their own podcast, which I'm not sure has anything to do with Goalhanger. It might be a thing they're doing on their own. The name of the podcast is The Book Club, which is it's an anagram for We Hate Search Engine Optimization. And the Book Club is great. And I like it for all the reasons I think you should like it, which is they often cover books I've read. They just did East of Eden, which I loved. It was one of those books like the Brothers Karamazov, like some of my favorite novels, the Brothers Karamazov, 1Q84, that just blew my fucking mind when I read it. Often because of the quality of the prose. That's something I don't think people credit that often when they're reading, is like, is it just fun to read this stuff? Is it just fun to read? Like, yeah, the Brothers Karamazov is long as shit, and it's hugely tedious. But I just love that guy's writing. I didn't care how long it was. Same thing with Murakami. I'm like, man, this guy could write about anything, and I would chew it up. I would love it. But I don't necessarily, because of the subject matter or how serious it is or how deep it is or how I felt afterwards, I don't really yearn to go back to it. I saw that, Gwilyn. Thank you. We'll take your Bezo bucks. I mean, East of Eden is one of these tomes. It's huge. And I basically agree with Tabby, and I basically agree with Tabby, and I didn't agree with Dom regarding the quality of it. And she said something that really resonated with me. I shouldn't have needed to hear her say this to think of this, but maybe her saying it gave me permission. She's like, I tend to gravitate toward really masculine, tough prose, sparse. And I'm like, yeah, me too. Everything I write is like that. In fact, I just said this to Paul Hughes, our line developer for Draw Steel, where I'm like, you will learn this over time, is that what I like as a writer is I like tough, sparse, masculine prose interspersed with flowery Elizabethan bullshit. Because to me, the one earns you the other, right? And you gotta, it's fantasy. You gotta spice it up every once in a while, right? And they mentioned that they were going to do, and I think it's tomorrow, which is why I felt like I had a deadline, that the next episode, they drop a new episode in every Monday, that they were going to do The Bound of the Baskervilles. And so that's how we got here. I was like, well, and I had already, this crazy thing is they said, oh, we're going to do Hound of the Baskervilles this Monday. And I'm like, I literally just started reading Hound of the Baskervilles again last night. I've read a lot of Sherlock Holmes stuff in my 20s. I basically didn't like it. I know it's a strange thing to say. I love the character of Sherlock Holmes. I love a lot about the world that he moves in. I just don't like that guy as a writer. I just don't like reading Conan Doyle's prose. That being said, I think a lot of that is just the decade in which my tastes were baked in and the decade in which he was writing. Because, and this is a thing we mentioned yesterday, so you can go back and watch this, but I know a lot of people, different times of day and different days attract different people. So those of you who weren't here, this is their first time hearing this. Sherlock Holmes comes from the same place as Jack the Ripper. There was a law that they passed in England in like the 1840s or 1850s, the goal of which was to achieve universal literacy. And they did it. They said every child is owed an education, universal education, which had never happened before. And it worked. It worked. And that was the 1840s or 1850s. And now it's the 1880s. And there is this new gigantic, insatiable market for writing. Everyone can read. So no more broadsheets, newspapers. My God, like so many newspapers, magazines, newspapers being published 3 times a day, the morning edition, the afternoon edition, the evening edition. People were reading all the time. People were reading in the 1880s the way people in the 1950s were smoking. They would read on the train. They would read at work. They would read on their break. They were just reading all the time, and everyone was doing it. Right? So in 1888, there is a man murdering real women in Whitechapel. Probably one guy, probably these 5 women were all murdered by the same dude, although we don't know. And that is a thing that happened and was happening. Meanwhile, there's literally millions of people who are desperate to read anything. And what they tend to gravitate toward is the same things we gravitate toward now. If it bleeds, it leads. They want lurid soap opera nonsense. They want clickbait. They were hungry for clickbait, and there was no amount of it you could produce that would satisfy them. And so a writer at a newspaper invents the character of Jack the Ripper. And people go, so there's this person and this event in the real world, and then there's this fantasy version of him that the newspaper invents. They gave him a name, right? The newspaper reporter invented that name. And the guy with the top hat and the opera cloak and the medical bag, and he's in a coach, right? That a newspaper writer invented that dude because he's just trying to sell newspapers. He's just trying to make a buck, and they're trying to, it's like exploitation movies in the 70s, right? There's this huge underserved market. If we just make anything they like, they will eat it up, and we'll all get rich. And that is also where Conan Doyle as a writer comes from. Suddenly a guy like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle could make a really good living just being a writer. Just writing fiction? Are you kidding? Yeah. Yeah. And there was no end to it. And he got so sick of Sherlock Holmes that he kills him off. And then, people are like, you can't do that, man. There's literally millions of us spending a lot of money reading his stuff. And they didn't really want anything. Conan Doyle wrote other stuff that was hugely influential, like The Lost World and stuff like that. But so he had to go back to Sherlock Holmes. So yeah, Sherlock Holmes is often paired with Jack the Ripper in modern fan fiction, but the connection between them is a lot stronger than I think people realize. They are both fictional characters invented by writers in the 1880s just to exploit this gargantuan ocean of readers, which I think is amazing. And then it's the 1980s, and they're coming up on the 100th anniversary of Sherlock Holmes. And I think it started off as the BBC wanted to do like a definitive edition of it, but they ended up the people inside the BBC didn't agree on whether or not this was going to be a hit. So should it be prestige or should it be cheap? And that kind of, I'm almost certainly mistelling the story. You can go look it up, but it ends up at Granada Television, which is an independent TV station, TV network in the UK at the time. And I think independent TV stations were relatively new in the 80s. I think they'd only been around for like 20 years, which, I mean, that's a lifetime in some cases. But looking back, it's like, they were still, I went to England in the 1980s, and you turn on the TV and there were 4 TV channels. The TV sets all came from like the America and Japan and stuff. So they had 12 stations. It was just BBC 1, BBC 2, BBC 3, BBC 4, BBC 1, BBC 2. I'm like, what the fuck? And that was a real culture shock. I'm like, damn, these guys do not have the same kind of choice that we do. We had UHF and VHS and all kinds of stations as a kid. And so, yeah, Granada Television puts this on, and they get Jeremy Brett. And Jeremy Brett was kind of famously, he was in My Fair Lady. He's young Frederick, who is the courtier, the suitor to Eliza. And they wouldn't let him sing, which is too bad because I think he had a really good voice. And he's young and charming and fun. And you would see that performance and you would assume that he went on to be huge everywhere. But I don't know. I think he became like a theater actor. And then the next time we see him kind of in the culture doing something huge, it's the Granada series, the Granada TV Sherlock Holmes series. And he took it incredibly seriously. And I think it's because he knew this was going to be his legacy. He knew that this was how he was going to be remembered. And he probably understood that he was in a position to play Holmes in a way that a lot of other actors didn't, that he understood Holmes and Conan Doyle as a writer. So he became sort of the trustee of the show. He was the one making sure they got as close as they could to the books. And that's one of the reasons people who are huge Sherlock Holmes nerds love the Jeremy Brett thing, because big chunks of the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes are just the book, the dialogue right out of the book. And I only got about like 10% into the Hound of the Baskervilles before I was like, and you saw me yesterday. There's a bit that we're like, how far are we into this? We are 24 minutes into a hour and 40-minute long show. So we're going to do the bulk of it today. And I'm like, this is going to be real interesting. How do they do the letter in the show? Because this dude shows up to talk to Holmes and he's like, I want to read you this legend, the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles, and it's in the book. It's like fucking the Silmarillion. You're like, well, Jesus God, this thing is so long. And it's a dude in the 1880s, Arthur Conan Doyle, trying to write in the style of somebody in the 1730s or 1740s, right? So it's even more abstruse and arcane. And I'm like, just trying to conjugate these sentences is giving me a headache. And I'm like, how are they going to do this? And it's brilliant. It's brilliant. I'm like, my God, all this dialogue is right out of the book. That's literally what the guy said. And then that guy said this. And then they get to the letter and Holmes just opens it up and goes, okay, so this is what it says. This guy did this. And I was like, oh, that's so much better. I wish Conan Doyle had done that. What he just did is readable and interesting and fun. So yeah, this is classic. The Hound of the Baskervilles is one of the 4, I believe, Sherlock Holmes novels. I believe the first Sherlock Holmes story was a novel, A Study in Scarlet. And that's 1887, I think, 1887, 88. And then it's like a year or two before we get any more Sherlock Holmes. And then all of a sudden it's an industry, right? He's just writing short stories and in magazines, published in magazines. They might have been serials. So it's mostly short fiction, which is, by the way, the novel is a lot like the album. That was not a thing really until the 1960s, 1970s, which is interesting. This both happened at the same time. If you read science fiction in the 20th century from 1900 to about 1970. So if you read science fiction in that 70-year period, you were almost certainly reading short stories in magazines. And then they would do what was called a fix-up, which is they would take a bunch of short stories and have the writer rewrite and re-edit them into one thing. Like Tales of the Space Beagle is a great example of this. Super fun, sci-fi, romp. It's sort of where the Voyage of the Space Beagle is sort of where Star Trek and Alien come from, which that is a crazy evolutionary tree. But it's a bunch of short stories that are tied together with this overarching thing and then published as a novel. So novels were sort of like the rare prestige format where a publisher might go, of all the sci-fi junk we've published, this one thing was popular enough that if we polish it and publish it, it would sell on its own as a novel. But generally, it was short fiction. Same thing with music. Singles. It's all singles. Albums are literally just a collection of singles. Like a photo album is a collection of photographs. A record album was just a collection of the singles. And then sort of the Beatles invent the idea of the album as the work of art, right? And even they were a singles band, right? So yeah, he was writing short fiction because that's how you were a writer for, from the 1880s to the 1970s, almost 100 years. And it's really interesting because it's kind of like science fiction. Like literary science fiction is unrecognizable from filmed science fiction. Literary science fiction tends to be a lot more serious and thoughtful, and filmed science fiction tends to just be high budget Saturday morning cartoon stuff. With rare exceptions, I would say like Arrival is a good example. The Andromeda Strain is a good example. Those are much more akin to literary science fiction. But the problem is the people who love making stuff like that love it because they're science fiction nerds and they read the short story, and then they get upset because the audience doesn't give a shit about actual literary science fiction on film, right? They want Star Wars. They want Star Wars or Star Trek or something like that, or Guardians of the Galaxy. And it's like, okay. So that's the difference between film and print. What the hell was I just talking about? I got distracted by chat. Novels, albums, film and print. Yeah. The thing is, so it's like science fiction, right? Where there's the film version of sci-fi, and if all you know is science fiction movies, you think sci-fi is that. But if you've read sci-fi, you're like, whoa, you are applying the same label to two wildly different phenomenon. Yeah, Sherlock Holmes in movies and TV is sort of a supernatural character. He is supernatural. He's like Reed Richards or Dr. Doom or something. He's one of these comic book characters who is smart. He's so much smarter than any real world human could be. It's essentially indistinguishable from magic. But the book version of Sherlock Holmes is not like that at all. The whole point of the book version of Sherlock Holmes is that you could do what he does. You could do what he does if only you lived the life he does. When he reads somebody and he's like, okay, I can tell you're this and you're that and you're from here and you did this yesterday and your mom is like this. And the person's like, how the fuck do you know that? This is like magic. Holmes is like, well, obviously you haven't read my monograph on the different ways wool suits wear over time. I bought 150 wool suits, new ones, used ones, and I did a literal scientific study of how wool suits age over time, and I published it in a scientific journal, and obviously you haven't read it. If you had, you would be able to, right? And you never get that in the movies. You never get that in the movies. It's always he's like a Bene Gesserit, right? He can just read this person, and it's like, oh my God, Holmes, how did you do that, right? But yeah, man, it's the literary version of Sherlock Holmes is just way more interesting, I think, than the filmed version. The film version is sort of the Saturday morning cartoon version of Sherlock Holmes. And that's one of the things I like about the Jeremy Brett version is they don't cheap out on that, well, obviously you haven't read my monograph on cigar ash. Right now in the book, what he'll do is he will actually describe that monograph. He will say, I went to this store and I bought all these cigars and blah, 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 blah. In the Jeremy Brett thing, he just mentions it and moves on, but that still grounds it in this reality, which I think is awesome.